Both sides of my family, on my mother's side and on my father's side, are longtime Hungarian residents. I have information on my mother's side going back to the 1780s, and on my father's side, maybe not quite that long, but they both were resident in Hungary. We don't know exactly when they migrated to Hungary from other parts of Europe or elsewhere. I do know that I'm 100% Ashkenazi because I've had my genetic test done. And on my mother's side, my mother's mother was born just north of Lake Balaton, and her father was born not far, actually, it's now a suburb of Belgrade in Serbia, right on the Danube. So the other opposite side of Hungary. Hungary was quite large at the time during the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it's not surprising that they would come from different parts of the country. They both wound up in Budapest, which is where those two grandparents met. On my father's side, almost the entire family, both on his mother's and his father's side, were from what's now in Slovakia, in southern Slovakia. My father himself was born in Bratislava, which is right on the Danube, on the north bank of the Danube. And his family came from towns right around Bratislava, within 50 miles of there. My father and his parents moved to Budapest when he was 4, and this was before World War I. My father was born in 1908. He and his family moved to Budapest in 1912. The war broke out in 1914. And at the time, he already had 3 brothers who moved with him, who were born in Bratislava. My mother was born directly in Budapest already. Both of her parents had moved to Budapest. My mother's father somehow got into the business of film importing in the 1910s already. And by the 1920s, he was a well-known film importer and producer. He produced 7 of his own films. My mother was in some of them as a teenager. She was a very attractive young woman, and it was obvious that my grandfather wanted to use her in the films. They were Hungarian films. He was ultimately bankrupted in around 1930 when the film M came out, directed by Fritz Lang. And it was a very risque film. Peter Lorre played a mass murderer, rapist kind of character. And my grandfather decided to import the film into Hungary, but soon after, the Board of Censors disallowed it. They wouldn't let it come into Hungary, and he lost his fortune. And from then on, things got rough for him, and he had to retire. And he was in his 50s at the time. On my father's side, the family was not particularly well off, although there were cousins who had established themselves in the leather trade and had a very luxurious leather shop. But my grandfather himself was sort of a ne'er-do-well, and someone did him a favor and set him up in Budapest in a grocery shop. So for the rest of his working career, he ran a grocery shop in the Jewish neighborhood in Budapest on Dobutsa. Now, his side of the family was quite religious, and my grandfather was Orthodox. He prayed every day. He put on the tefillin and tallis and went to shul every morning and did the whole thing. My mother's side of the family was much more assimilated, and as far as I know, neither her father nor her mother were believing Jews. They certainly were Jews, and they knew they were Jews, but they didn't go to synagogue. They perhaps celebrated a holiday or two, but that was the extent of it. Whereas my father's parents were much more uh, believing and orthodox in their behavior, and they raised their kids that way. So my father was brought up in an Orthodox household where the father ran a kosher grocery store. Both of my parents went to gymnasium, and in fact, they met when they were both taking violin lessons together, which I only learned much later. They didn't have anything to do with each other for years, but they had met. The Jewish community was pretty tight in Budapest. It was also very large. Uh, Probably 30% of the population in Budapest was Jewish at the time. Uh, in the early years, they were quite free. There was a very liberal atmosphere until the fascists took over in 1919 already. And while there was a sense that anti Semitism was there, Jews were still pretty much allowed to do what they were doing. A very large percentage of doctors in Budapest were Jews. A very large percentage of lawyers were Jews. And people like my parents were able to move freely. My mother dressed very nicely. They were able to go out, and they went to theaters. And my father had a little, uh, I guess it wouldn't be a canoe, it would be more like a rowboat. And he had a little rowboat house that he shared with a friend of his right on the Danube, and there was a little clubhouse there. So there were opportunities, and it's just that as the 30s wore on and as the war broke out, things got much worse. By the 1930s, Hungary had a fascist government, and they passed a set of numerus clausus laws, which were quota laws that limited the opportunities for Jews. It limited the kinds of professions they could go to, the schools they could go to, what they could do in general. And as the 30s wore on, and particularly as events in Germany became more menacing, the enforcement of the numerus clausus became stricter. And by the time the war began in 1939, uh, they passed a whole new set of laws that was specifically intended to discriminate against Jews. My father himself was a direct victim of those laws. He had been an executive, an accounting executive at a large construction firm where he had worked for about a dozen years already when the war broke out. And at the end of the year, on December 31st, 1939, he got a letter from his boss saying that he would no longer be able to continue working there because he was the last Jew employed in an executive position. And what that meant for him personally is that he had to give up a career that he was trained in, that he had gone to school for, and take up an entirely new occupation. And it was those relatives who ran the fancy leather goods store who took him in and taught him the leather trade. So at the age of 31, he had to take up a new profession, and he eventually, within a year, started his own little leather shop during the war. This was already during the war, but the Jewish laws were such that he couldn't actually own the shop, and they had to hire a non-Jew to be the legal owner of the shop, even though technically it was owned by my parents. By 1940 already, which was already into the war, a year into the war, the Hungarian government decreed that adult male Jews would have to be interned. And so my father was swept up along with pretty much everyone he knew and put into the first of multiple forced labor battalion camps. And he managed to be in and out of these camps throughout the war and survived them, escaped, would get caught, be put into another one. And he actually documented this. He has dates that he wrote down for when he was in which camp. And he spent pretty much most of the war in and out of these, occasionally having leaves. He was able to get out of a camp during the time that I was born in 1943, visit my mother, see me as a baby, and then go back into the camp. And he was able to bribe people and get his way. And people were manipulative, but it was a difficult life. He complained about this bitterly for the rest of his life, that what he was made to go through, both the indignity, having his superiors be people who used to be people that had worked for him, or people who had been in servile positions suddenly were in charge of the people working on these road gangs, and the actual conditions under which he had to work, like sleeping out in the rain on the road, repairing roads, breaking rocks, creating trenches for the soldiers. So he did this more or less continuously all the way from 1940 until Budapest was liberated in January of 45. And for the rest of his life, he complained that he had been made neurotic, nervous, that he had rheumatism, he had gallbladder attacks, and he never quite got over that. I mean, it wasn't a concentration camp, and it wasn't life-threatening in the same way as being shipped to Auschwitz, but it was certainly debilitating and humiliating, and it had an effect on him for the next part of his life, next 50 years of his life. In 1944, while he was at a forced labor camp, a priest came along and said, anybody here among you Jews who is interested in converting, we'll save you. We'll give you a papal document saying that you've converted and you won't be persecuted any longer. So a lot of them thought, should I do this? I mean, I don't really care about the paper. It's a meaningless piece of paper, but if it's going to help save me, maybe I should do this. So my father went to his father, who was Orthodox, and he said this. And at first, his father, I mean, the normal inclination to something like that among Orthodox Jews would be to disown the son if the son did something like that. And my grandfather did say that that would be the normal thing to do. But at the same time, in the Torah, it would have said that you need to do whatever you should to save your life, that's more important than anything. So he basically gave my father his blessing to go ahead with that. And then an absurd situation came up where my father said, okay, I'll go ahead and do this. And the priest took a bunch of people into the church, and one by one, he would call them up, call their names, and then dip his finger into a bowl of holy water and sprinkle the person and say, you're no longer a Jew. At which point my father burst out laughing at the absurdity of the fact that here their lives were in danger for being Jews, but that somebody would sprinkle a drop of water on him and that would make him no longer a Jew. So he almost ran out of the place because he couldn't contain his laughter, but he went through with it, although he never told me this. And it was only much later, when I was an adult, that I actually found the certificate, which I have, to show that he did go through with the conversion. So partly because of that, I'm sure he experienced a sense of shame. He never considered himself Christian. I mean, there was no question about that. And he always considered himself Jewish. As soon as my father went into the forced labor camps, my mother took over the little business, which was really just a small manufacturing place where they made handbags and wallets and belts, and had customers, not direct customers. They would supply other shops who would then sell their wares. So my mother became the de facto boss of that factory. She learned how to use the sewing machine, which is what she wound up doing for the rest of her working life. She was a a handbag sewing machine operator. So she was able to carry on. And even while the war was going on in 1940, 41, 42, conditions in Hungary were not as bad as elsewhere. Partly that was because Hungary was allied with Germany. So it was not subjected to German aggression because Germany was a friend and the Hungarian government was a fascist government. So they more or less let things alone until quite late in the war. And it was really only in the spring of 1944 that the Germans got wind of the fact that that the leader of Hungary, had concluded that Germany was losing the war, and he was ready to engage in talks with the West. And so Germany didn't like that, and they came into Hungary and invaded in the spring of 1944 into what had been a friendly country and installed their troops. And later that spring, they sent Adolf Eichmann to Budapest to take care of the Jewish question, and that is to take all the Jews who were left in Hungary, and Hungary was one of the last places that the Jews had not been taken out of. And so his mission was to eliminate the Jewish population in Hungary, and he began that in earnest in the late spring of 1944. At that point, the Hungarian government sort of collapsed, and it was taken over directly by the Hungarian Fascist Party, the Arrow Cross Party. And then things got really bad. People like my mother eventually were forced to move into a neighborhood in Budapest that had been designated as a ghetto. So in the fall of 1944, she, her mother, her sister, my father's sisters-in-law, and me were rounded up and put into the ghetto where we were. It was a very small area, several blocks square, where something like 200,000 or more people were put and expected to just stay there until they could be evacuated and sent to concentration camps and eliminated. My one grandfather, my mother's father, was taken away in the fall of 1944. He was put on one of those trains and never heard from again. My grandmother, his wife, was accompanying him right to the train, and somehow, through a stroke of luck, she managed to get put to the side and went back to the ghetto and wound up surviving and lived all the way to the age of almost 88 in the US. During the time they were in the ghetto, they had no idea what their fate would be. They knew that the Russians were close to liberating Budapest, but they really didn't know if that would happen or if they would be put on trains and sent to Auschwitz first. So it was a harrowing experience. My father wasn't there because he was in forced labor camps. My mother and I were there along with all kinds of families, her in-laws, my father's parents, her own mother, her sister, and they were suffering terribly. There was not enough food. It was horrible. I mean, she's written about this, and it was clearly the worst time in her life. I mean, there was nothing close to it. People didn't know where they would get the next loaf of bread. She was approached by soldiers who were ready to arrest her, and somehow one of the soldiers took pity on her and was nice to her and let her go and gave her a loaf of bread. So there were stories like that. We don't know exactly what else may have transpired between the soldier and my mother, and we have our suspicions that she would have done whatever she had to do, but that part was unspoken. Anybody who was caught leaving the ghetto, leaving the walls of the ghetto, was threatened with being shot immediately by the Hungarians, by the Arrow Cross Party. And luckily for everyone, Eichmann never completed the evacuation of Hungarian Jews. He started with the Jews in the east, all the way in the east, in what's now Romania, emptied that out, and was working toward Budapest. But fortunately for all the people in the ghetto who made it through, because there was a lot of disease and pestilence and people dying of cold in the winter. But on top of that, bombs were falling, and they were Allied bombs. It wasn't the Nazis who were bombing Budapest, it was the Allies, because they knew that Hungary was ruled by a fascist government. Budapest was liberated, and a lot of the Jews at the time felt a kind of euphoria, like they had been saved, they hadn't been killed, they hadn't been deported. The Russians were here, they were socialists, things would get better. My father, who was a lifelong cynic and a skeptic, didn't believe it. He didn't buy it. And already in the first few months of the new regime, this is beginning in the spring of 1945, he saw that a lot of the people who had been arrow cross fascists suddenly put new uniforms on and became guards with the new communist regime, or let's say pro-communist regime at the time. And he didn't believe in any of that. And he already began looking for ways to leave Hungary. So almost the minute the war ended, he contacted his brother in France. He had three brothers living in France, to try to resume his search for a visa to leave to go to France. My family lost their apartment. They had lived in a really nice apartment building along the banks of the Danube. It was a building that had been constructed by the company my father worked for, and they provided apartments for the high-level employees. They certainly lost the apartment, and they had to move into a different building. So when I was born, they moved into a different building that no longer exists in the heart of Budapest, in central Budapest. My mother was able to take a lot of her possessions with her from the apartment that they had to vacate into the new place that they lived in. And somehow, almost miraculously, she was able to extract some of those possessions and take them with her to Paris when my family and I moved to Paris after the war. She took rugs, and there was a whole collection of photographs and paintings and artworks, and managed to hold on to them. We don't know exactly how. Some of them were possibly sent to pawn shops, and she kept the tickets and was able to retrieve them after the war. She may have secreted them or left them in certain places, but she didn't lose everything. There were Russians who came in and out of the apartment. The Russians already had a reputation for being drunkards, and the Russian soldiers, that is, drunkards who would steal anything, drink cologne. Yeah, I mean, these were stereotypes, but these were things that my parents attested to. They came in, bullied people, took possessions inside their apartments. So conditions weren't great, but they were reasonable enough that my parents were able to resume a quasi-normal life. My parents put me into a fencing school, and at the age of less than 4, 3.5, I was taking fencing lessons. Fencing was considered among Hungarian Jews to be like one of these socially upward things to do. It was a way to get into higher levels of society. My mother commissioned an artist to come and do my portrait in pastel, which is hanging in the other room here. She had her own portrait done. They had nice photographs done. The pictures of me as a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, I looked like a happy kid. I had toys. I was well dressed. But under the surface, my father was seething, and he couldn't wait to get out. And finally, in the early summer of 1947, the French visas came through. And at the time, the Russian Iron Curtain hadn't been put down yet, and we were able to get permission from the Hungarians to leave. We left as stateless people because our citizenship had been taken away during the war. It was never restored. And we emigrated to France in 1947 and joined my father's three brothers and their families. In 1945, my father, along with a lot of Hungarian Jews, uh, decided that carrying a German sounding Jewish last name was at the least inconvenient. Weiss, which was a very common Hungarian name. It meant white in German. The most common names were the names of colors: Schwarz, black; Weiss, white; brown, brown; Grün, green. And people, on the one hand, they didn't want names that sounded German because they had such a bad feeling about German. And secondly, they didn't want to be tabbed immediately as Jews because they knew that it was Jews who had those German names in Hungary for the most part. So he, along with a lot of other people, went to the authorities, to the local city hall, and petitioned to have their names changed. And at the time, a very common process, and this had started already in the 1910s. It wasn't limited to the end of the war. It's just that at the end of the war, there was a rush to do this among a lot of people, whereas before, it had been a periodic process. What people typically did is they picked the name of a Hungarian town or city and put an I at the end of it, which meant that you were from there. Even though they weren't from there, it was just they picked whatever they liked as a sound and made the name up. So in my case, my father picked the name Varad, which was the name, it was a generic name of a city. And in particular, there was a place called Nagyvarad, which is now in Romania. It's called Oradea. And he picked Varad and put an I at the end of it, and it became Varady. So that was the way he picked his name. And his motive was that he knew already in 1945 that his next destination would be France. He wanted something that could be easily pronounceable in French, and he had studied French in school, so he knew that Varady would be easy to pronounce. France, of course, had its own story with Jews, and it was not a nice story. My three uncles were in hiding during the war. They were Jews who had married non-Jewish women, and luckily for them, the non-Jewish women helped hide them. But they basically had to be in hiding, even though two of them had actually been in the French army at the time. One of them was captured for a time and somehow survived. So the French had a very unhappy history of treating their own Jews, and here we were in France. The remarkable thing that I remember already, because 2 years after we moved to France, my father's Orthodox parents moved to Paris. My father arranged for his parents to move, and I would go with my grandfather to shul on holidays, and I, I every week when school was out on Thursdays, I would spend Wednesday night at my grandparents' house, and my grandfather took me to shul in the morning every Thursday morning. Other than that, there was no mention of Judaism in France. People in France typically are a-religious. They don't talk about religion. They don't talk about they don't talk about work. Like around the dinner table, people don't talk about what they do for work. They certainly don't talk about religion. So being Jewish in France was unspoken. No one mentioned a word of it. My parents never mentioned it. However, all of their friends were other Hungarian Jews. So while it was unmentioned in public, in society, among French speakers, among people that they worked with, it was not unmentioned socially because whenever they got together with friends, it was other Hungarian Jewish emigres who had moved to Paris. And there, the stories were constantly about what happened during the war. So all of the discussions, and this is from my childhood, from the time that I was 4 until I was 9, all I heard on Saturday nights when my parents got together with friends was what happened in the ghetto, what happened in the forced labor camps, what happened with people having to stop being lawyers or doctors or whatever, or accountants or whatever they were, and talk bitterly about their experience in Hungary and how glad they were to be able to leave. I wouldn't say my parents decided to leave France. I would say my father decided to leave France. My mother was already reluctant to have left Hungary because she left her mother in Hungary. So she was happy to be in France. She liked France. She learned French very quickly. My father learned French very quickly. And they enjoyed being there. Of course, they had the three brothers in the family, so they had a family. They had made friends with these other Hungarian Jewish emigres. But 2 years in, so this would be around 1949, after my grandparents had moved there, they both realized that they were spinning their wheels economically. They were working very hard and unable to save anything. My father had become a leather worker. He went into the leather trade, and that was what his brothers, two of his brothers in Paris, did as well. So it was relatively easy for him to set up a little shop where he hired one of his brothers to work with him, while the other, the wealthy, well-off, long-term French brother, he had moved there in 1927, was able to get him contracts to sell to. So he was in the leather trade, and my mother worked at the little shop that they had. But it was very hard work, very long hours, and they were unable to save any money whatsoever. My parents had somehow miraculously gotten permission to apply for visas to come to the States. And it was a quirk that did it. My father had found out earlier that year, so in January, that the US, which was categorically not admitting Hungarians because Hungarians were on the losing side of the war, they were an Axis power, they had decided that Hungarians who had been born in what subsequently became Czechoslovakia were eligible to emigrate to the US under Czechoslovak quotas. And my father, having been born in Bratislava, was eligible to come into the US, even though he had never been a Czechoslovak. Czechoslovakia was created in 1919, by which time he had been living in Hungary in Budapest for 7 years. He had never lived in Czechoslovakia, but the U.S. decreed that he'd been born in Czechoslovakia, and so he was able to come in, got visas for the three of us, and we were able to get boat tickets, and we left in June of 1952. I spoke not a word of English because I spoke French basically and Hungarian, and spent the whole summer with my parents, their friends, their relatives, no exposure whatsoever to English. And I was enrolled in school without speaking a word of English. And because I should have gone into the fourth grade, and because I spoke no English, they put me in the third grade, which I had already done in Paris. But by the time December came along, I was already fluent in English. And the following year, I skipped the fourth grade and went directly into the fifth grade, still living in the Bronx. What was my relationship to Judaism? I would say close to non-existent because of the tradition in France that I referred to, that people didn't talk about religion. Even when all of those Jewish friends got together, they didn't talk about being Jewish. They talked about what they experienced. And so, because there was this generalized silence about religion, and my mother had never been religious. My father, partly because he was brought up Orthodox, rebelled against it and became very secular. He was not interested in religion. We had moved to Queens, and all of my friends were Jewish. And they were all having bar mitzvahs when they were turning 13. It was my turn. So when I was 12 and all of the other kids were going to Hebrew school, I said to my parents, I'd like to have a bar mitzvah, and they agreed. Up until then, there was hardly any mention of religion in my household. My parents didn't celebrate holidays. We didn't celebrate Hanukkah. We didn't have a menorah. We didn't celebrate Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur. And I think it partly goes to what my father felt, that he had somehow betrayed his heritage. And my mother, for her part, had no feelings. She, of course, had to take religious training when she was a student in high school, because all the kids did. If you were Christian, you had to go to Christian after hours. If you were Jewish, you were put into Jewish after hour religious training. So she certainly knew she was Jewish, and she knew that everybody in her family was Jewish, but religion was not part of her life. And so I was brought up secular. I have a feeling about Yom Kippur. I like the Kol Nidre. Uh, I I'm not a believer. I have a very strong Jewish cultural identity. I'm very proud of being Jewish, but I'm not a religious person. We never called it the Holocaust. In fact, the code word for it in Hungarian is just háború. It's just the war. They only refer to it as the war. And obviously, the war, for a Hungarian non-Jew to talk about the war would mean one thing. For a Hungarian Jew to talk about the war meant what it meant. It meant people being taken away. It meant people being put into forced labor camps. It meant the Jewish laws. So it was always referred to as the war, never referred to in any other terms. I don't remember the term Holocaust coming into use in general language until maybe the late 60s, even in English. I mean, so I'm not sure how people thought of it in the US prior to that in terms of the vocabulary that was used. Uh, so in my case, I was always aware that I was a survivor of that experience from the very earliest stage. I mean, from the time that I knew that we were leaving Hungary. Why I knew why we were leaving Hungary. I was only 4, but I was on a train with my mother. My father had left a couple of months earlier to set things up in Paris. My mother and I were on a train. We went from Budapest through Trieste, so through what's now Slovenia and Croatia, up to Trieste, and then we wound up in Turin, where we stayed overnight, took a train to Paris. I knew I was doing that, and I knew I was doing it because we were leaving Hungary, and we were leaving Hungary because of what had happened. So I always knew that from the very earliest stage. Let me start with my mother, because that's the easier of the two, and I've already addressed some of the war's impact on my mother. She was very much into living for the day. She liked to have a nice time. She liked to go out in the evening. She dressed immaculately. Everyone who met her thought she was just an astonishingly beautiful, elegant woman. And she was brought up to think that she lived that way. That was the way she wanted to think of herself. So for her, the war was a, a one-off. It happened. It was horrible. She was willing to talk to people about it, exchange views, but she didn't dwell on it. So she lived her life and wanted to just continue living. My father, on the other hand, did dwell on it. He first of all, he dwelt on it from a health point of view. He had nearly died from a gallbladder attack during the war, and he resisted being operated because he said that at the time the people doing the surgery were dentists operating on gallbladders. So he was out for long periods with gallbladder attacks, with terrible pneumonia and arthritis and all kinds of things that he attributed directly to the conditions that he experienced. He was a very nervous person, neurotic in many ways, uh, very hyper and cynical, a lot of negativity, all of which he attributed to the war years, because up until then, he was a very outgoing person who liked to go out dancing. He played soccer. He had the rowboat. It changed his life. My father was embittered for the rest of his life, and it was mostly, he said he never wanted to go back to Hungary, but he did go back, and we went back together. The first time he was back was in 1977 with my mother, my wife, and my daughter. We were all there during the summer, and he was really unhappy because every time he saw a Hungarian face, he would think of all those Hungarian non-Jews who treated him like dirt, who treated people who had been at least their equals at the time like they were worms. And he couldn't look anybody in the face. Every time he saw someone, he was angry. He eventually, later on, toward the end of his life, he went back a few times, uh, mostly to take advantage of the fact that he had a Hungarian pension. And at the time, Hungarian currency couldn't be exported during the communist regime. And so you had to spend the money that they gave you in country. And his attitude was that he would flush it down the toilet before he would let them keep it. So he went back and went to some spas and took treatments and things like that. But for the rest of his life, he basically hated Hungarians. While my father suffered because of it, he wasn't reluctant to talk about it, and he didn't lay a trip on me. I never felt like his experience made me an unhappy person or somebody who had trouble adjusting. I mean, I had to adjust to two different countries, learn two new languages, and it came easily. I mean, partly because my parents were very encouraging, and I always felt that they didn't try to hide any of that from me. They were open, and it was part of who I am. From the moment that he found out that the Germans were offering reparations under certain conditions, he jumped on the opportunity. And he began pursuing reparations for which he did for the rest of his life until his dying day. By the time he died, he had three different sets of payments that he got from the Germans. He had the pension that he got from the Hungarians, and he got a small pension from the French. But the one that he relished the most was the German reparations, and there were different types. The first one was for just having survived. But to do that, he had to suffer incredible indignity. The Germans, to begin with, didn't necessarily believe everybody who said that they had gone through what they went through. You had to prove it. You had to have documentation, as if, people were able to have documentation during those years, during those terrible years. And then, because he claimed that he had a disability for his neuroses and nervousness, they made him go see a German psychiatrist repeatedly, who would interview him and make him even more nervous and demand that he prove that he had the condition that he said he did. So eventually he prevailed. He got the first set of reparations. And then, in a very peculiar thing, when he was about 80, the Germans introduced a new kind of claim. And that was for people who were native German speakers, for Jews who were native German speakers. The theory behind this was that the closer you were to Germany, the more you were wronged. In other words, the closer you were to being a real German, even if you were Jewish, the more you were wronged. And the further out you were, the less you were wronged. So if you could prove that you were a native German speaker, you were entitled to more than anyone else. Well, it turned out that my father was a native German speaker because his mother was a native German speaker who only learned Hungarian as an adult. And so most of the family conversations took place in German. And my father was a really good German speaker. So at the age of 80, they made him go to the consulate in Miami. He lived in Fort Lauderdale in Florida, and prove by an exam, a written exam, that he could speak German fluently, which he did. And he passed the exam, and they gave him extra money for being a native German speaker. And then, on top of that, the whole time that he lived in Florida, every year he had to show up at the consulate to prove he was alive. It wasn't good enough to have an affidavit signed, notarized, go to the bank. It wasn't good enough. They needed to see you living and breathing before they would believe that you were alive, because the Germans suspected that the Jews would just, do whatever they could to keep getting payments after they died. So my father was very bitter about this. And how did I feel about it? I didn't feel nearly as strongly as he did. I certainly vicariously, I was sympathetic to everything that he had experienced, and I was very sympathetic to his feelings. But I didn't feel personally the same way about seeing a German as he did. I never, I was too young to have seen a German actually, kick someone or anything of that sort. So my experience was like anyone else's in movies and TV programs. My father was a very, very determined person. When he came to the States, he had to go into the leather business, the leather trade. He was living in New York, and the leather trade is a seasonal trade, which means that there were long periods of the year when people are not working. And he was in that category. So for the first couple of years we lived here, he was unemployed a good part of the year. He made very little money. My mother was in the same trade. She was a little less unemployed, but made even less than he did when she was working. And he spoke no English, zero English. And for the first, I'd say, 4 years that he was in the States, he whatever English he knew, he refused to speak publicly. But he would buy the New York Times every day, and he would get through the New York Times with a dictionary. He was determined. That was the word you used. He was determined to learn English. And just at the 5 year period, at the 5 year mark, just when we were about to become citizens, he decided that he would speak English openly, publicly, albeit with an accent, but quite good. And his grammar was very good. He was very attuned to grammar. And at that point, he determined that he would go back into accounting, which of course he couldn't have done not speaking English. I am both first and second generation. I'm first generation because I physically lived through that, and I could have easily died as a baby. And the impact that made on me when I realized that is that, and this goes to your question about religion, that I would have been killed as a 1 year old not for my beliefs, but for being Jewish. And so for me, that was what being Jewish meant, that I would have been killed for being it, not for believing in the scrolls or, davening every day. That wasn't why the Germans would have killed me, but they would have killed me for the mere fact of being Jewish. And I always knew that from the smallest age. I was always conscious of it. And from the earliest age, I told people that. And I, I, I remember certainly as early as junior high school being willing to talk about that. Certainly in high school, I went to a special high school where the kids were very enlightened, and most of them were Jewish. And I certainly talked about my background. I've always thought it was important to tell my story just for my own personal reasons, that I I was proud of the fact that, Jews could survive that kind of thing, that I had survived it. And I always thought that it was important for people to know that and to hear it firsthand. And the obvious thing is, look, I'm going to be 80 next summer. I was a baby. I mean, the people who were conscious are in their 90s, and they're not going to be around. So the idea that uh, young generations will no longer be able to hear the direct thing makes it that much easier to refute. And of course, we read the papers, we know it's being refuted every day in larger and larger volumes by more and more people. So it's incredibly important to have people know that this really did happen and that people were capable of doing this. What would be the lasting impact of telling this story is, one would hope that it would enlighten people not to do this again, not only to Jews, but to other populations. And if you look at the news and read it carefully as I do, you realize that there's not much hope for that. That just isn't what humans do. They don't listen to stories and behave differently because of them. But nonetheless, I think those of us who do this, do feel an obligation. We have to tell that story and only hope that it'll make a difference, at least among some of the people who hear it. I like to think of my father as a cynical pessimist, and I like to think of myself as a cynical optimist. So I'm actually, in the big picture, I tend to be optimistic about things, but for the things that come up, I'm generally cynical and skeptical. And it doesn't really take a cynic to extrapolate from what we see in the news. It would be easy to just say that the current rise in Nazism, fascism, anti-Semitism is due to a particular single cause, but it's not. And people draw parallels to economic conditions and things like that. Other people say, well, anti-Semitism never really went away. It was always there. I don't have a pat answer for that. Things do tend to come in cycles. They're not exact replications of themselves. Conditions are never identical. Context matters. Populations do tend to be prone to listen to demagogues, and demagogues do come along, and certain ingredients tend to be there that allow that to flourish. And I think we're in a period where that happens, and the optimist in me tells me that this too will pass, that we're in such a period right now. It it rises and it crests, and eventually people will get on to the next whatever it is. the next fad, or this seems to be in vogue for the time being, and I think it'll pass. But that doesn't minimize the damage that it does while it's happening.